Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. A July morning in Surrey. A 41-year-old woman tells her partner she's heading out to feed the animals at a small farm. She drives away. After that, nothing verifiable places her alive again. No body is recovered. No murder scene is identified. Yet within 4 years, a jury will say the evidence is enough. Her name is Tina Baker. On July 8, 2002, she leaves a home in Sunbury-on-Thames with a practical errand: check the animals at Brookfield Farm, near Chobham. The route is routine. The task is ordinary. For investigators, that matters. Routine creates a baseline. When the baseline breaks, it tells you where to look. Hours pass. There is no return, no phone contact that reassures family or friends. Early checks hit the first 2 tripwires investigators respect in a disappearance. The household dog is found abandoned, and her bank account shows no activity. Pets don't take care of themselves. Money rarely sits untouched when a person is voluntarily traveling or starting a new life. The absence of both points away from a planned departure. Searches begin. Officers and dogs work the farm and surrounding lanes. The objective is simple: find a scene, find a trace, find anything that turns speculation into fact. They don't. No remains. No confirmed struggle. No recovered weapon. That negative result defines the case from the first day. Time becomes the crime scene. When you cannot tape off a room or a field, you tape off the hours. With a victim profile and a reliable schedule, attention shifts to the last window in which Tina can be placed with certainty. Investigators note the recent marital separation and pending divorce, context, not conclusion. They chart who had reason to see her that morning, who had access to the farm, and who sat inside her circle of routine. They begin collecting records that don't forget: phone logs, tower hits, and any camera coverage tied to approach roads. In a missing person file that may escalate to homicide, those data points are your anchors. By nightfall, the tone of the inquiry changes. It is still a disappearance on paper, but it behaves like something else. The dog. The frozen bank account. The lack of a trace at a property that should have left one if Tina had simply gone about her work and returned. Nothing here is dramatic. It doesn't need to be. Good cases are built on plain facts that hold up later, under oath. For viewers who live in quiet towns, here is the sober takeaway: when a dependable pattern stops without explanation, it is a lead, not a feeling. In places like this, crimes don't always shout. They show up as a missed chore, a silent phone, a gate left the way it shouldn't be. The first 24 hours were spent turning routine into data. Officers traced the route from Sunbury-on-Thames to Brookfield Farm, then worked outward in measured circles. Gates, fence lines, footpaths, lay-bys. A missing person protocol is built to answer one question fast: is there an obvious place where a person came to harm? Here, there wasn't. No visible struggle on approach roads. No disturbed soil that justified a spade. Buildings at the property were checked in daylight and again after dark with lamps, nothing that altered the status of the case. In practical terms, the investigation entered a rarer category: no body, no scene, and still enough concern to treat the absence as a warning sign rather than a coincidence. Teams brought in dogs trained for cadaver detection as well as scent tracking. The handlers worked them on prevailing winds and along natural catch points, hedgerows, drainage lines, the shaded edges where odor lingers. The dogs didn't indicate. Negative results matter. They tell you the search area might be wrong, the timing too late, or the method unsuitable for what actually happened. The farm and its near boundaries did not yield a trace that met evidentiary standards. That forced investigators to define the scene differently: not a room, not a clearing, but a window of time between a known departure and a failure to return. With no physical anchor, the job became documentation. Officers photographed structures and the animal enclosures to preserve a record of how everything looked before attention drew crowds. They logged what was present and, just as carefully, what wasn't. Vehicles on the property were identified and accounted for. The animals were checked, fed, and relocated as needed so the ground underfoot could be examined without interference. Every small action served one purpose, to make sure that if something surfaced later, the record of this day did not undermine it. Neighbors along the approach roads were contacted in a structured sweep. Investigators weren't looking for rumors, they were looking for observable facts: an unfamiliar vehicle parked where it didn't belong, a closed gate that was usually open, any break from habit. Some said they saw nothing unusual, some mentioned only the weather and traffic. Information like that seems thin until you realize it eliminates noise. Nothing in those first interviews created a new place to search or a threat that could be acted on. The absence of sightings began to feel like the only consistent detail. In cases like this, the question becomes whether the person ever began the routine they described. That point, did she truly reach the farm, was still unproven. Without a witness placing her inside the gates, you don't assume it, you verify it. That meant logging roadway cameras were available, checking shop fronts on the arterial routes for partial views of the car, and preserving any clip that might show a time-stamped passage. At this stage, it wasn't about who did anything, it was about whether the route itself left a footprint that could be scaled into a timeline. The farm, as a physical environment, offered little. The roads might offer more. Search management then moved to miles, not meters. Watercourses near Chobham were walked with poles and waders, not to chase a theory but to satisfy a checklist. Culverts and bridge undersides were visually cleared. Rural laybys were photographed at tire level so impressions could be compared if a suspect vehicle emerged later. None of that delivered a break. It did, however, make the record more durable. When a case advances to court with no body and no named location of harm, jurors need to see that early searches were disciplined and complete. By the end of day 2, the command team adjusted posture. This was still a disappearance, but the weight of indicators pointed away from a voluntary absence. A dependable adult leaves for a short task and disappears. The household pet is abandoned. Financials remain still. A farm that should carry signs of a morning's work carries none that help. In towns like these, crimes don't always break the quiet, they distort it. The investigators kept emotion out of their reports, but you don't need feeling to read a pattern. The task now was to replace empty ground with traceable time. For viewers who follow true crime closely, there's a value judgment here. The decision to call in more specialized units without a traditional scene isn't dramatic, it's cautious. Families deserve caution. Communities deserve a process that doesn't jump to conclusions. The path forward would not be a trench line in a field, it would be a grid of timestamps, phones, sightings, presents, stacked until they formed the shape of a day. The search shifted from fields to files. Investigators requested call detail records, tower logs, and any roadside camera coverage that could put timestamps on movement. The goal was narrow: reconstruct a single morning in July 2002 with enough precision to test every claim later made about it. When a case lacks a physical scene, time has to do that job. First came the call pattern audit. Analysts pulled outgoing and incoming activity for the key phones connected to Tina's circle, then compared those logs against the hours she was expected to be on the road. Silence can be a data point, so can routine pings that place a handset where it shouldn't be. Technicians mapped cell site sectors along the route from Sunbury-on-Thames toward Chobham and flagged any handset that landed inside those sectors during the target window. One device mattered: it consistently placed a known person near the farm that morning, within a slice of time that would later be central in court. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean doesn't always mean innocent, it means you double-check. Next, the team worked external eyes. In 2002, coverage wasn't comprehensive, but there were pockets: petrol stations, shop fronts at junctions, private security cameras on business estates. Officers canvassed with still frames and lists of approximate times, asking for footage that captured vehicles matching the ones relevant to the inquiry. Most tapes were overwritten. A few yielded partial views: a car of interest moving in the right direction at a plausible hour, a glimpse on an approach road that narrowed the window when a person could have reached, or left, the area. These were not dramatic shots. There were timestamps that locked the grid a little tighter. Parallel to cameras, analysts reviewed voicemail checks and message retrievals. Each login or call attempt carried a network time. If a person tried to reach Tina during that morning, the system logged it to the second. If a device suddenly stopped generating routine traffic, no calls, no checks, no data, that gap was recorded too. You never build motive from these numbers. You build presence and opportunity. The difference matters. Investigators then reconciled phone positions with verifiable tasks at the farm. If regular chores were truly started or finished, there would be a likely time frame. If they were never started, the window shifts. That's where the time is the scene mantra earned its place. A handset near the farm while no one can place Tina inside the gates pressures the timeline. It doesn't prove a crime. It proves proximity when proximity is hard to explain. Detectives also ran a logistics check: who had reason to be mobile that morning, who had access to vehicles capable of quick, unrecorded travel through rural cut-throughs, and who had business that could plausibly excuse a detour. They documented those answers without assigning weight. The function of this chapter in the file was to define when each relevant person could be at point A, point B, or nowhere near either. In a courtroom, the cleanest questions start with where and when. To strengthen the record, the team synchronized all time sources. Footage was compared against the national time standard, phone provider clocks were reconciled to avoid minute drift, officer notes tied field interviews to those same references so a defense couldn't claim a mismatch later. Good cases withstand friction. They don't avoid it, they prepare for it. One additional step helped. Investigators looked at contact behavior inside Tina's network in the week before she vanished. They weren't hunting gossip. They were establishing cadence, how often certain people called her, when, and from where. That way, any deviation on the morning itself could be measured. If a device that usually remained static during those hours suddenly moved toward the farm, that shift meant more than a single dot on a map. It meant a break from pattern. By the close of this phase, the desk had a working model, a narrow window in which Tina could have reached the farm, a corresponding window in which a known person was placed near it, and a road grid that showed realistic entry and exit paths. None of it identified a place of harm. None of it found a body. But it replaced guesswork with a documented sequence. When a case later withstands appeal, it's usually because this part was done right. A quick human note here, because these stories involve people before they become cases. Families live inside the hours we're charting. To them, every tick on this timeline is time they still don't have answers. The best service investigators can give is accuracy. Accuracy holds up for families when everything else starts to slip. By day 3, the case needed a human timestamp, not just a digital one. Detectives returned to Brookfield Farm with a tighter canvas of the lanes, this time re-interviewing people whose routines touched the property, a delivery driver who passed the gate most mornings, a neighbor who walked dogs along the hedge line, and a grounds worker who serviced a nearby field. One account finally stood out. Late morning on July 8th, a witness reported seeing a man at the farm entrance, agitated, brief, and unmistakably in a hurry, telling the witness the area wasn't open to visitors that day. The exchange was short, less than a minute, but it supplied two things the file lacked: presence and demeanor. The interview was recorded in full: start time, end time, location, and environmental conditions. The officer took a fresh statement away from the farm to reduce suggestion. The witness identified the date with reference to a personal appointment and a work log, which allowed investigators to fix the sighting to a narrow window that overlapped the phone sectors, already placing a known person near the farm. When a timeline has to hold up in court, convergence matters more than color. Here, the statement converged with the grid. Next came reliability testing. Detectives asked the witness to describe the man's clothing, vehicle, and direction of travel. No leading prompts, no multiple-choice hints. The witness recalled a vehicle type and color but not a registration. That's common in rural settings. People notice the unusual, not the alphanumeric. However, the reported color and style matched a vehicle known to be accessible to the person of interest that morning. Investigators didn't announce that match. They logged it and moved on to eliminate error. A second pass through the lane found no work crews or scheduled visitors who might explain the sighting. The delivery driver had been there earlier and noted nothing blocking the entrance. That sequence, clear earlier, blocked later, built a simple, testable order of events. Officers then stress-tested memory. They revisited the witness at a different hour on a different day and asked for the same account, this time with the map closed and no notes on display. Details stayed consistent: the position by the gate, the short length of the exchange, the impression of tension. When a detail changed, hand position, whether the man leaned on the gate or stood off it, the team treated it as normal drift, not deceit. Courts are wary of mirror-perfect retellings. Consistency on the essentials carries weight. Photographic recall of the trivial often does not. The statement's value wasn't just about the man at the gate. It was about what he was not doing. He was not feeding animals, not moving tools, not performing any routine that would suggest a normal morning at the farm. That negative observation supported the existing concern: either the expected tasks never began, or they were interrupted very early. In a case without a physical scene, that matters, because it reframes the last safe moment to a tighter band of minutes. Investigators also used the sighting to reevaluate drive times. If the witness encountered the man at the gate shortly after the key phone sectors lit up, the team could estimate how long someone might have been on the property before being seen, and how quickly they could have left undetected via the minor roads. Traffic on those lanes was light at that hour. That meant entry and exit could occur without creating additional witnesses. Nothing about that conclusion proves a crime, but it removes the assumption that many eyes would have noticed anything unusual. In places like this, routine masks movement. For fairness and completeness, detectives sought any rival explanation. Was there a legitimate reason to restrict access that morning? A sick animal? A safety issue? No record supported that. Farm use logs were thin, but the absence of a legitimate closure reason was noted. The team also checked whether the witness had any dispute with the farm or with anyone connected to it. None appeared in local records. The statement stood on its own. What did not happen is as important as what did. The witness did not claim to see Tina arrive. The witness did not describe a confrontation or a vehicle leaving in haste. The account is narrow but clean: a man at the gate, brisk dismissal, a tone that suggested pressure. That is the kind of fragment that prosecutors later stitched to the digital grid: phone near the farm, vehicle consistent with access, behavior inconsistent with ordinary chores, and no benign reason to restrict entry. A jury doesn't need drama, it needs a chain. There is a human layer here that is easy to overlook. People who come forward in rural cases often worry about taking sides. They still have to use the same roads, see the same faces in shops, and live with the knowledge that their single minute of observation might matter for years. Respecting that risk is part of doing this work right. You don't overclaim on their words. You document them, you test them, and you place them where they belong, in the framework of time, not speculation. This sighting did one more thing: it justified expanding the next phase. With a corroborated human timestamp, detectives had grounds to revisit the vehicles associated with the farm and those accessible to people in Tina's circle, not to accuse, but to look for any maintenance records, fuel receipts, or changes in condition that lined up with the narrow window now on paper. The file moved, quietly but clearly, from open fields toward transport and disposal logistics. That is where the next discovery would surface. With a credible sighting locked to late morning and the phone sectors lining up, investigators turned to transport. If the farm wasn't yielding a location of harm, the next logical question was whether anything, or anyone, could have been moved quickly and without notice. The call records offered a narrow door. On the same day Tina vanished, a number linked to a friend who operated a local breaker's yard pinged the log. It wasn't proof of disposal, it was capacity and access. In cases like this, capacity matters. Detectives split the work into two tracks. One team validated the contact itself, provider records, timestamps, duration, direction, so a defense couldn't dismiss it as a noise call. The second team went to the yard with a precise request list: visitor sign-ins, weighbridge tickets, crusher schedules, fluid drain logs, and any job cards documenting dismantle work in that 48-hour window. Procedures vary across yards, and paperwork can be thin in places, but legitimate operations keep enough scraps of record to reconstruct a day when they have to. The weighbridge book gave them something concrete: 2 entries on July 8th tied to small loads, one early, one mid-afternoon, consistent with the yard's ordinary business. Nothing screamed suspicious. The crusher log showed routine use but no extraordinary run. The fluid drain logs were in order, which told the team that vehicles processed that day went through the standard environmental steps. None of this proved anything about Tina. It did show the yard systems were in place and that, if a vehicle had been processed, there would likely be a paper footprint, even if clipped to a single line. They asked for surveillance. In 2002, many yards used simple fixed cameras to watch gates and scales. The manager said tapes were overwritten, common at the time. Detectives documented that answer, then asked for secondary indicators that survive longer: parts invoices, cash takings, and supplier pickups that might indirectly confirm an unusual job. The manager produced a stack of receipts. Most looked ordinary: alternator here, bumper there, nothing in quantity that matched the hidden salvage. But detectives weren't chasing parts, they were tracing movement. If a vehicle connected to anyone in Tina's circle had visited, a plate, a VIN, or a scribbled make-model note could be sitting in a margin. A follow-up with the operator who ran the crane that week gave more context. He described a slow Monday, a couple of quick strip-outs, and a standing order from a hauler. He did not remember a rush job. He did not recall turning away a private visitor. That helped rule out a dramatic drop-off. It didn't rule out a phone call about availability, which is exactly what the records suggested: a contact on the day, not a recorded transaction. The distinction kept the file honest. Back at the station, the team cross-checked the farm timeline with realistic drive times to the yard and to other industrial sites in range. Rural roads near Chobham allow discrete travel, but you still have to account for distance and the time it takes to stage, load, and return. The window was tight. Add that to the witness placing a man at the gate and the phone sectors near the farm, and you get a sequence that could work only if all steps happened efficiently. That kind of efficiency tends to leave marks: fuel, receipts, a call for help lifting a shell. None appeared in the first pass. The yard angle still earned its place because it explained opportunity. It showed that someone with access to the farm could also reach a site capable of destroying or hiding a vehicle. It justified deeper checks: plate readers on nearby trunk roads, where present, recovery company logs, and searches for short-term hires of trailers or flatbeds. Investigators also quietly asked 2 other yards within a reasonable radius for the same week's paperwork, in case a caller hedged bets. Those shops reported nothing out of pattern: no after-hours drops, no cash jobs that made them uneasy. Detectives took the conservative step of photographing drainage pits and the crusher bay at the main yard, not because they expected trace, but because later arguments often revolve around what was preserved when nothing obvious was found. They logged the yard layout, the approaches, and sight lines from the gate. If a vehicle had arrived that day carrying anything it shouldn't, there were only a few minutes where it could have slipped through without a second pair of eyes. That kind of negative finding strengthens or breaks theories later. Here, it kept the theory modest. This is where the human side intersects the procedural. People who run legitimate yards know their reputation carries the business. Cooperating with police isn't just civic duty, it's survival. The manager handed over what he had, answered what he could, and didn't try to fill blanks with guesses. That restraint matters. It protects the file from contamination by speculation and keeps the narrative disciplined, even when the public wants drama. By the end of the breaker's yard phase, investigators had a consistent element to add to the mosaic: a same-day contact to a facility capable of making evidence disappear, no supportive paper trail for an actual drop, and no CCTV to settle the question, typical for the era. The lead didn't crack the case, but it moved it. It shifted focus from the farm's ground to the logistics of removal. Combined with the witness at the gate and the phone sectors, it sketched a plausible path of travel that could be tested against every other piece collected later. For anyone following closely, there's a reason these steps feel methodical. Families need conclusions that stand when challenged years later. Rushing to label the yard as a disposal site without records would damage the case. Documenting its realistic capacity without claiming what you can't prove strengthens it. That's how no-body prosecutions survive, and the steadiness of what they don't overpromise. When a case moves without a body or a fixed scene, history can matter, but only if it's handled exactly. Detectives reached back into Martin Baker's past to examine prior statements reportedly made to a previous spouse, threats that referenced killing and feeding to pigs. The job wasn't to dramatize them. It was to verify they were said, date them, and determine whether a court would allow a jury to hear them. The interviews were taken on neutral ground, recorded, and supported with anything that could anchor memory: old diaries, separation paperwork, contemporaneous confidences to friends. Investigators looked for drift between early accounts and later ones. What they wanted was consistency on the core: who said what, to whom, and in what context. They also documented the absence of embellishment. Where a witness answered, "I don't remember," that was logged. Overreach ruins credibility, restraint protects it. Next came corroboration by conduct. If a threat mentions a method or a setting, investigators examine whether the speaker had real-world access to make that method plausible. Here, the farm context already existed. Officers reviewed husbandry records, waste handling, and feed deliveries. They surveyed pig areas, manure pits, and runoff channels, not because they expected a recovery months later, but because thoroughness would be questioned in court. No remains were found. No trace altered the standing facts. Still, the checks had value. If the defense later implied police avoided unpleasant places, the record would say otherwise. The legal threshold mattered. In England and Wales, prior bad acts or threatening statements can be admitted where they show relevant background, motive, or intent, subject to judicial control to avoid unfair prejudice. Prosecutors don't get a free pass. They must prove that the evidence helps the jury understand patterns without inviting a conviction for character alone. Detectives worked with the Crown Prosecution Service to ensure the proposed testimony was specific, anchored to time, and presented as one tile in a larger mosaic, not the case by itself. That mosaic already included the digital grid and the witness at the gate. The prior threat strand did something different. It addressed mindset. It didn't prove an act on July 8, 2002. It offered the jury context for why an otherwise ordinary morning could turn into a decisive one under pressure: separation, property risk, and control. To keep that context from overpowering the file, the team drafted clear, factual summaries for court. Exact phrasing were remembered, the relationship in which the words were spoken, and the lack of any recantation by the witness. Detectives also anticipated the obvious counter: memory can harden after a disappearance, and people can retrofit meaning onto old words. That is why the file emphasized independent anchors: who was told at the time, what was written then, and whether any third party heard similar words before July 2002. Where a corroborating friend existed, their account was taken separately and compared for overlap without prompting. Where no corroboration existed, the statement stood alone and was labeled accordingly. Transparency like that signals to a jury that investigators didn't round off edges to make the story smoother. There's a human layer worth acknowledging. Asking someone to repeat a violent threat from a prior relationship forces them back through years they'd rather forget. Investigators kept those sessions short and focused. No editorializing, no nudging. The point wasn't to relive personal history, it was to mark the existence of words that might now carry probative weight. By the time this strand was ready, the file had a disciplined shape. We had a last known movement window, ground searches that found no scene, a digital timeline placing a known person near the farm, a reliable witness who met a man at the gate, and a same-day contact with a breaker's yard that established capacity. Now we had prior threats, verified, time-placed, and prepared for careful presentation. Not a confession. Not proof of an act. A mindset tile. Handled this way, the evidence gives viewers and jurors something solid to weigh. It respects due process while acknowledging risk. In rural cases, communities are quick to fill silence with speculation. The rule here is simple: let only what can survive challenge make it into the narrative that decides a life. 3 years is a long time to hold a file open. By the fall of 2005, Surrey detectives had a case that didn't look like most homicides: no body, no identified murder scene, no weapon. What they did have was structure, each strand tested, documented, and resilient. To move from suspicion to action, the file had to meet a precise standard: with the evidence available, is there a realistic prospect of conviction? The review team rebuilt the day of July 8, 2002 on a single board. First row, last known movements: Tina leaves Sunbury-on-Thames for Brookfield Farm near Chobham. Second row, negative search results: no recovery, no seeing. Third row, digital grid, cell site data placing a known person near the farm in the key window. Fourth row, the gate encounter, an identified witness places a man on the property that morning, hurried and dismissive. Fifth row, logistics, same-day contact with a breaker's yard, establishing capacity and access. Sixth row, context, prior threats from a previous relationship, checked, time-anchored, and readied for controlled admission. Seventh row, motive frame, separation, divorce, and a shared 14-acre property at risk. The exercise wasn't theatrical, it was defensive. Prosecutors see cases the way juries will see them later, tile by tile, not headline by headline. Investigators stress-tested each tile against the most likely defense angles. Could the cell site data be coincidence? They answered with sector maps, drive times, and the lack of benign reasons to be at the farm that morning. Could the witness be mistaken? They answered with consistent retellings, an external time reference, and the absence of any personal dispute. Could the breaker's yard contact be insignificant? They answered with day of timing and the facility's proven ability to dismantle and crush vehicles, capability, not accusation. Could prior threats unfairly prejudice a jury? They answered with limits, exact phrasing where remembered, presentation as mindset context, not as proof of the act. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the package. In no-body cases, the weight comes from convergence. Each piece on its own might feel thin, together they show presence, opportunity, means, and motive. Importantly, the file avoided claims it couldn't support. It did not invent a disposal method. It did not assert a recovered trace. It did not promise a witness who saw Tina harmed. What it offered was a coherent narrative that explained why a dependable adult vanished inside a narrow window and why a specific person was positioned, prepared, and pressured at the exact time it mattered. Practical steps followed. Arrest plans accounted for safety, media risk, and evidence preservation. Interview strategies were drafted to test explanations against the board. Why be at the farm in that time band? Why restrict access at the gate? Why the call to the yard? Why the property pressures? The idea wasn't to force a confession, it was to contrast any offered account with the documented sequence and lock contradictions to tape. October 2005, action was taken. The arrest closed the gap between a careful build and a public case. Family were notified with clarity, the evidence had reached the line. Investigators did not offer promises, they offered process. The charge followed, murder, setting the path toward the Central Criminal Court in London. From that point, every earlier decision would be tested in open court, the restraint with which the yard lead was handled, the careful framing of prior threats, the clean boundaries around what the evidence did and did not show. There's a human reality here that doesn't weaken the file, it underscores its purpose. Families wait through years of uncertainty, communities absorb rumor. The only antidote that lasts is a case that survives the hardest questions. If you're going to ask 12 citizens to find guilt without a body, the groundwork must be exact. The courtroom made the case plain. No body. No identified murder scene. No weapon. The Crown didn't hide those gaps, they organized what could be proved. Jurors walked the July 8, 2002 timeline step by step, cell site data placing Martin Baker near Brookfield Farm in the critical window, a credible gate encounter showing access and pressure, and a same-day call to a breaker's yard establishing capability to destroy or conceal evidence. Prior threats from an earlier relationship, lawfully limited and time-anchored, were admitted to show mindset, not propensity. The separation, divorce process, and shared 14-acre asset supplied motive without being asked to carry the whole burden. Each strand stayed in its lane, the strength came from convergence. The defense urged the jury to focus on what was missing. The judge's directions were precise. A conviction can rest on circumstantial evidence if, taken together, it leaves no reasonable doubt. The jury returned guilty. In November 2006, Martin Baker was sentenced to life imprisonment, minimum term 14 years. No hidden twist. No second ending. On appeal in November 2008, counsel attacked the weight of the timeline, the handling of the witness, the breaker's yard lead, and the admission of the threats. The court upheld the conviction, finding the directions sound and the mosaic legitimately put. Later, in August 2020, a new search at Priest Lane, Bisley, supported by the Army, sought Tina Baker's remains. Nothing was found. As of October 23, 2025, the public record is unchanged. The conviction stands. Her remains have not been recovered. No specific murder location has been identified. This ending isn't cinematic, it's durable. Investigators didn't oversell the yard lead. Prosecutors didn't turn background into verdict. The court limited what the jury could hear and how they could use it. In cases like this, restraint is a form of respect, respect for the victim, for the family, and for the standard that protects everyone. If there's a takeaway worth keeping, it's that patterns matter. When routine breaks and someone vanishes, careful work, timestamp by timestamp, statement by statement, can still carry the truth. Tina Baker's story never gave police the closure of recovery, but it did earn a judgment built to survive time. I've told this case the plainest way I know: careful work, no shortcuts, respect for the standard. If you take anything with you, let it be this: speak up when threats surface, check in on the people who keep your life steady, and trust patterns. When they break, act. Justice isn't perfect, but disciplined truth-telling keeps families from being forgotten. What did this story teach you about responsibility and courage? Tell me what city you're watching from, and on what phone, TV, late-night shift. If this reached you, please subscribe and share. If it missed, say why. I read it all.